Thank you so much for watching. My name's Glen Morgan, and this is We the Governed. So today we're going to be jumping right in a story that I think is very current in today's news, and it has to do with the fact that the state of Florida here is actually suing Washington State. They filed a lawsuit last week, and specifically they filed a lawsuit against Washington and California. And in Washington's case, it's because the Department of Licensing here has been handing out commercial driver's licenses to illegals, clearly unqualified illegals, and they've been doing it for years, and it's become a huge problem. Now, if you've been paying attention to this story at all, and I'll link to this down below, this is actually the front page of the lawsuit. It's been filed in the federal Supreme Court. And for those of you who care about Washington State, it's a 31-page lawsuit, pretty short, but go straight to page 13 because that's where it really starts talking about Washington's commercial licensing scheme and the failures. So I'll link to that down below for those of you who want to read it, and I'd encourage you to. It's not a very long one, but it's important to understand kind of the background here. Now, if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you hit the like and subscribe button down below. Really appreciate all the people who are sharing these videos out there and expanding the audience. The more people who do that and leave comments, tell me what you think. It really does help these videos get seen by more people. And I think more people need to see them because there are a lot of things that Washington State, particularly those in the political class, absolutely don't want you to know. And if people like me aren't out there sharing that information, nobody will know. So let's just get into the story here. Essentially, this is a lawsuit from the state of Florida against both California and Washington. And just real quick, I want to clarify, they did file the same suit essentially against both states in the same lawsuit. So mostly in the news, you've been hearing about California, not so much about Washington, but Washington State's clearly named there, and we are one of the two states that Florida is suing on this issue. Now, this is actually important because one of the people will oftentimes say, well, I don't hear anything about Washington, but this is going to be in front of the Supreme Court, and it's happening right now. Now, one of the reasons why you don't hear as much about Washington is because essentially California is the big gorilla in the room. They are essentially the 800-pound gorilla. That's what the feds are fighting, and other states are fighting because of just simply the absurd and ridiculous policies that they have in that state. And in comparison to California, Washington State's kind of a mini-me floating around out there. So you got Governor Newsom, Gruesome Newsom, down there in California running the show and turning that state into a basket case. And then you have the mini-me, which is Bob Ferguson, Governor Bob Ferguson up here in Washington, kind of running around and basically following in his shadow and clearly subservient to the governor of California. And that's why really you hear more in the news about California, a much bigger state. Now, one of the things that they say in this lawsuit is why they're filing it directly with the Supreme Court is that that's the court of jurisdiction under Article 3, Section 2 of the federal Constitution. If you went to public school, I know you probably never read it, but I will link to that down below if you want to look it up yourself. And that is also because one of the clauses it says in there is that the Supreme Court's there to resolve any controversies between two or more states. And that's the correct venue to go to. And so in federal court, it just makes sense. Now, I really want to dig into this. Again, go to page 13 and 14 in this federal lawsuit. Really, I just start right here where it says Washington's commercial licensing schemes and failures. And you really look at this, essentially it boils down to just a couple of things. In 2019, essentially, this is when Washington passed the Keep Washington Working Act. It's the sanctuary state law that you hear former Attorney General, now our Governor, Bob Ferguson, the dear leader of Washington State. He brags on this law. He loves this law, and this is a sanctuary state. This is why Washington State has become a magnet for criminals and drug cartels and illegals all over the country, and he's very proud of this law. And essentially, one of the specific things that it does, it prevents Washington State from collecting information on illegals or people who are here without any kind of citizenship status of any kind at all. And that, by the way, is no accident. It was in 2019 when you really saw the shift to the Department of Licensing. I'm going to point this out because Governor Inslee at the time fired the head of the Department of Licensing. Remember, this was under the Trump, the one agenda. And ICE at the time was looking into exactly how many illegals does Washington State actually have. And of course, that's the last thing anybody at Washington State wanted to share with the feds. And so the head of the Department of Licensing at the time was just following federal law, was providing that information to the feds, and got fired from the Department of Licensing by the Inslee administration. And so right around that time, that's when they passed this sanctuary state law. Things got worse, of course. And one of the things that they ended up doing, and something I confess I never really looked into. I knew the Department of Licensing was corrupt and mismanaged, but I didn't look into the CDLs at the time. But according to this federal lawsuit, between 2018 and 2025, Washington State has admitted that they have issued at least 685 commercial driver's licenses without verifying citizenship or residency at the time. Now, keep in mind, just because they didn't verify that, it doesn't mean that it's absolutely certain that they're illegals. It also doesn't mean that the people that they did give driver's licenses to, that they're actually citizens, because there's a lot of problems with fake ID coming into the country as well. So this is really just a snapshot, and really those 685, that's going to be the first thing that people will look at, but it's probably quite a bit worse than what they're representing here. Now, finally, of course, you had illegal drivers, basically, and this is what Florida is arguing in this case. With Washington State CDLs, they're actually killing Florida residents by causing traffic accidents, totally avoidable traffic accidents, and this has also caused Florida, then, of course, to have a substantial increase in cost of enforcement, because now they realize that a large number of commercial driver's license holders in the state of Florida coming from out of state, and remember, these guys travel all over the country, they're clearly illegal, they're not here under any kind of legal citizenship status, they can't speak English, they might not be able to drive their trucks, and there's all kinds of other problems, and we're going to get into some of those a little bit here. Now, the main story here, of course, the reason why is because of this guy right here. Basically, this is Harjinder Singh. He illegally crossed into U.S. from Mexico back in 2018, and I did a video about the story a little while ago. The Department of Licensing, of course, gave him commercial driver's licenses on July 15th, 2023. And then one of the many trips, and apparently that he was driving on, he illegally made a U-turn on a Florida turnpike, killing 3 people in a van on August 12th of this year. And when the police showed up there, he failed his English proficiency exam. He couldn't read highway traffic signs. He could only read 1 out of 4 signs. And then, of course, he fled Florida, and then Florida had to extradite him back from California. He did require an interpreter in court, and his illegal brother, who was also an illegal alien here, he was a passenger of the truck at the time, and he was, of course, also arrested for deportation. And then, of course, since they only killed 3 people down in Florida, the leftists in our state and the Democrats decided to organize an online petition to the feds saying, go easy on this guy, because this is exactly who we want to have in our country. Now, this is the accident right here, and there's 3 dead people underneath that tractor trailer there, and the Washington State, the driver who got the commercial driver's license illegally from Washington, he's the one that caused this death. Now, what I didn't realize until after I looked at this lawsuit was that Washington State actually, not only should they not have given this guy a driver's license anyway, but they gave it to him after he had actually failed 13 different times in different test attempts. 13 different failures. Now, I don't know if there's a specific requirement in Washington state law that says you need to be able to pass after a certain number of attempts. Try and try again, but I don't know how long that lasts. But apparently in his case, it was 13 different times. So this is not exactly a guy that was highly qualified for what he was doing. And of course, only after Washington State went down the yellow brick road and decided to hand out commercial driver's licenses to this guy, then California followed Washington State's lead and then gave the same person another CDL the next year. So it's just interesting to note Washington State actually moved on this and basically made the biggest mistake first before California followed our lead. Now, this is on top of the fact, and I talked about this before, of the Oregonian investigation that came out earlier this year in May about how unqualified truck drivers were hitting the Pacific Northwest roads in an obvious and pretty clear bribery scheme. If you hadn't read that article or go back and look at my previous video about it, I talk about it. Here's a picture of some of the cash payments. Basically, to bribe your way through the testing process costs between $520 and $530, and they paid cash to it. And as I talked about in the last video that I talked about this situation, one of the driving testers, this guy out of Skagit, who, by the way, signed off on apparently 900 some odd drivers in Washington State, when they put him under surveillance, and he was just put under surveillance for a limited period of time. They would sit there, and all day he would just sit in his truck, do nothing, probably surf on his phone, and then in his logs, he said he passed 6 drivers that day, for example. Now, they didn't, I don't understand why they didn't put him under surveillance much longer, but they did pull some of the drivers that he had supposedly tested and passed, and the majority of them failed and couldn't pass any of the tests. So clearly there's something majorly wrong in Washington, and these are just this is an example of the story. And this could be above and beyond just the 685 drivers that nobody bothered to ask what country they were from or where they lived or if they were U.S. citizens. Now, of course, this also raises the significant problem that I've talked about many times before about Washington State's Department of Licensing, which, of course, is where you go to basically, it's a black hole. They see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing, and then they just give out commercial driver's licenses, apparently to anybody, regardless of whether you can pass a test, regardless of whether you ever did pass a test, and regardless of what country you're from, whether you can speak English or you have any idea about what you're doing behind a 40-ton semi-truck going down the road. Now, you may think you can get away from this by leaving Washington State, but that's not true because these guys are driving all over the country, and it looks like they're killing people in whatever states they're driving in. This is not the only case. This is just one of the more recent ones, and this could end up being you no matter if you want to flee the state or not. And unfortunately, it's another example of bad things that happen in one state absolutely do spread like a disease, and they go all over the rest of the country, causing harm, mayhem, and death wherever they go, which is why you have to have some level of control. And in states like Washington or California or other states that are clearly doing the wrong thing, they have to be brought back into the fold, and they have to do things the right way, which isn't happening currently in Washington State. Now, this brings us to then a story related to this whole story out of Oklahoma. So Oklahoma basically decided to see just how bad is this, and they coordinated with ICE and the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. This is earlier this month, and they ended up arresting 91 illegal aliens who were driving 18-wheelers just on I-40, and this was just over 3 days. So in 3 days, they arrested almost 100 people who had been illegally driving large rigs through Oklahoma on one freeway, just one place. This is a huge problem. Now, many of them also had many other criminal convictions. They ended up arresting about 120 people for deportation during the same emphasis time. Most of them, though, were these commercial truck drivers. Some of them, I assume, the others were their seconds, just like the brother was riding with the other truck driver in Florida, the Washington State truck driver down there. But they also had plenty of other convictions for all kinds of other crimes. And, of course, they're out there driving on the road. Now, in this particular one emphasis here in Oklahoma for 3 days, they didn't arrest anybody with a Washington State commercial driver's license. Woohoo! Washington State, good job. We didn't have anybody there, but obviously this is a huge problem, and I suspect we're going to be seeing a lot more states doing something very similar. Now, the other thing, of course, that came out of this was the fact that they exposed that New York State, and potentially other states too, are handing out commercial driver's licenses where the name is no name given. I mean, this is how bad this thing is. When you have a sanctuary state that decides to completely abandon any concept of the rule of law and decides that citizenship is worthless. And so what they're trying to do is hand out benefits to illegals, particularly illegal criminals, as many people as they possibly can. They'll hand out commercial driver's licenses for a 40-ton rig to drive all over the United States, and they'll give you a driver's license that says no name given. Clearly, there's no tests, there's no controls, nobody's paying attention to what's going on here, and that's your government at work, particularly in a blue state, and particularly in a state like Washington, where they don't really believe in following the law at all. So, of course, the question is, what happens now? And that is a great question. Right now, you're going to see Governor Newsom. He's basically taking point on this whole thing. So he's in charge, and he's telling Bob Ferguson which way to jump. Bob Ferguson's just asking him how high and where he needs to go, and that's essentially what's going on right now. Because remember, as we mentioned earlier, California is the much bigger state. Washington State is a much smaller state, and Ferguson is clearly not the 800-pound gorilla in the room on this one. He is the monkey running around, following following wherever the 800-pound gorilla goes. So that's Newsom leading Washington State off the cliff and wherever they're headed. And again, the main focus here really ends up being Washington State Department of Licensing, who has clearly got their fingers all over this problem, and there's no controls. And that agency's entirely out of control, and it's been out of control for quite some time. And their whole upper leadership, upper management and leadership is a huge problem, and they need to be investigated. And this is on top of the fact that I've done these other stories for a number of years now about the specific department here, and they've registered obviously as many illegals and non-U.S. citizens they possibly could, and that's the other problem that gets uncovered in this whole operation here. And of course, they've had plenty of time now to destroy as many of the records they possibly can. It's not just paper records, of course. It's probably going to be a lot of hard drives that break mysteriously and a lot of data that's being erased or disappeared before the feds can come in and look at it. Now, that's presuming that you believe that the feds haven't already gotten copies ahead of time to see exactly what the Department of Licensing destroys that they subpoena those records for. But we will see, and that's a story for a future time, I suspect, which puts us in Bob Ferguson's head here because he has a dilemma. He absolutely wants federal cash, and keep in mind, both the Florida lawsuit that I talk about here is going to cost Washington State taxpayers because Florida wants compensation for the damage and harm that Washington State's causing to it, but it also has the potential to eliminate federal money that would otherwise be coming to the state of Washington because of Washington State's incompetent sanctuary city policies and the very harmful results that they've clearly produced. And it's not just in Florida, unfortunately, it's everywhere in America. But he does still want that cash. At the same time, he can't admit that the Department of Licensing has clearly been running amok with this egregious illegal activity, particularly since he was the former Attorney General, basically working in the same building just down the hallway, and he's intimately familiar in every way with all the illegal activity of the Department of Licensing. Bob Ferguson can't pretend like he doesn't know. This has happened with his full knowledge and awareness of the problem. And he's going to probably try to pretend, look away, act like it's somebody else, but he's the one providing both the attorneys to defend the Department of Licensing, the legal justification to the Department of Licensing to justify their illegal activity, and it's his office. He's in the same building, and the stuff they aren't asking him for, he's well aware of it. He's been working with these guys for 12 years before he became governor. His fingerprints are all over this. The challenge that he has is that the state budget is clearly collapsing in Washington State. Washington State's discovering that the Lafleur curve exists, that no matter how many stupid taxes they want to impose, and Ferguson signed on to a bunch of dumb ones lately, that actually there's not enough money left, and it's not coming in the way they thought it was, and it isn't going to. And in fact, the tax receipts are collapsing, and the state is, according to him, $2 billion underwater. According to OFM, it's $1 billion underwater. But this is Washington. What's another billion here and there? The state wastes that much all the time. So it's a problem. And of course, he's also desperate for any illegal votes that he can get. He knows that he wants to be on the ballot at some point in time, or more significantly, his political allies, and he needs to keep those illegal votes coming. And if the Department of Licensing gets thoroughly investigated, he has a problem. So Bob Ferguson does the one thing that he's super comfortable doing, which is always blaming Trump. So it's always going to be Trump's fault. In Bob Ferguson's world, Trump is clearly living in Bob Ferguson's head 100% of the time, rent-free. That's all Bob Ferguson can associate with his day-to-day. Obviously, he doesn't come to Olympia. He's living up north and Zooming, calling it in. But this is a problem for Bob. Governor Ferguson is dealing with this issue right now. Clearly, we're paying platinum prices for garbage government in Washington State. Despite the fact that the budget's practically doubled in over 10 years, we clearly are getting far lower quality government than we did even 10 years ago. And these platinum prices, super expensive budget, super expensive agencies, bloated overhead, ridiculous bureaucracy, and all kinds of costs in our government in Washington State, it isn't getting better the more money you throw at it. And yet, a lot of money is also getting stolen and wasted and squandered, hence the Doe's Washington classes, which I hope, if you're interested, you're willing to take. There will be a lot more of them as we move ahead. And that's why I say that we are clearly paying for garbage. We are paying platinum prices for garbage government, and this is one of the things that we have to fix. So, of course, people have to ask, and this is probably in your head too, what can I do about it? Well, number one, and I just think it's important, you have to stay engaged. You can't just sit back and think that your apathy is going to save you. Apathy is the enemy of freedom. It is the runway for bad things to happen in government. And if you're apathetic about it and don't care, that's the green light to everything bad happening around you. And that is not what we need. We need people to be engaged. You cannot get away from this. Now, sharing the truth is also important. Share it far and wide. Share it with people that aren't paying any attention, because ignorance is no excuse, and ignorance will not protect you either. If you remain ignorant about what's going on in government, it just means you're easier for them to abuse you more in the future as they try to think of new ways to increase taxes or new ways to implement policies that are going to be harmful to you and your neighbors and your family. So ignorance is not what we want. We want to be sharing this information far and wide and making sure that people know what's happening. Third, and this is just something you can actively do locally that's not as big perhaps as looking at the state government, but just start digging into local government. Just pay attention to what's happening locally. And I say this because, and this is one of the things that with the Doge training classes that we put on, starting locally is a good way to get your feet wet in exploring some kind of civic engagement with local government. Start looking through the budget. Start seeing how they squander and waste your tax dollars. Start paying attention to what they're actually voting on or doing in local government. School board, city council, county commission, fire district, port district, whatever it is that you are interested in, start local, because the more you get familiar with that, the more you're going to understand why the state's off the rails as you look further up the road. And it just helps. It gives you something to focus on. And it also gives you a way to also focus on getting to know other people who are in your community, who also share your concerns. Finding these people is actually a big part of holding government accountable. You're not alone. There's many other people out there who have the same concerns and interests that you do. They want government to be run correctly. They don't want schools that don't teach their kids math or English or anything else that matters. They do want government that cares about public safety and doesn't squander their money on esoteric, feel-good, kickback, virtue signaling schemes. They don't like the homeless industrial complex. They're just like you. They want to actually fix the problems that they see in their community. But in order to do so, you have to be involved, you have to be engaged, you have to be willing to show up. Because, as I always say, and it applies in this case too, the future belongs to those who show up.